Hello everybody and welcome to the shop. You may have seen an older video I did, I'm going to guess about 2 years ago, where I made a small part jointing jig. It was a sled for my table saw. I used the heck out of that thing. It's one of my favorite jigs. The problem is I made the darn thing out of MDF, and the MDF just didn't hold up. The carriage bolts with tightening them down and loosening them up, they just broke loose inside of the MDF. I was recently given this nice piece of oak 3/4 inch plywood, and what I'm going to do is cut it in half, and I'm going to make myself another sled. This stuff will hold up for years, and I'm looking forward to it because I really miss my sled. I use it a lot. I'm going to show you guys how I did that. I know I've already done a video on this, so I won't get into as much detail as I did last time. I'll kind of just hit the highlights, but I thought it was kind of cool, and it is what I'm working on. So if you want to stick around and see how I do it, please do. I'd love to have you. To start this project off, I'm going to need a couple of runners for my table saw. I went to my scrap bin, and I got a piece of 3/4 inch oak, and I ran it through my planer until I got a perfect fit. Now what I'm going to do is go ahead and rip a couple of runners off, and I'll make a few extra, keep around for future sleds, and then we'll start assembly of the main sled. Let me show you a little bit more about this runner. When I place it in the track, you'll notice first off that it's slightly below the surface. That's important. You want your runner to be below the surface of your table saw, so when you glue it to the bottom of your sled, it raises it up, which means it's not running along the bottom of the track, therefore no friction. You'll notice I've got a nice fit, no slop, and you'll notice that it moves back and forth very freely. I'm going to start out by bringing this piece of plywood to the front of my table saw and lining it up, just eyeballing it with the front edge. Next, I want to take a quick measurement from the edge of the slot to the blade, and I see that it's just shy of 5 3/4 of an inch. I'm going to add a little bit to that, let's say 5 7/8, and I'm going to flip the ruler around, and I'm going to go ahead and put a screw in this first hole. Now I'll just do a quick measurement at this end. Same thing, 5 7/8. And I'll go ahead and drive a screw down here. And I'll finish off the other 2 screws. I'm going to flip the sled over, line it up in the slot. And now what I'm going to do is raise the blade and run the sled through, giving me a 0 clearance on this side. Then I'll turn the sled around and do the same thing with the opposite side so that I can make a perfect cut right up to the edge of the jig, regardless of which side of the jig I decide to use. Now that I've got my sled perfectly squared to the blade, something occurred to me, and I don't know why I didn't think of this before, but I'm 0 clearance here. Why not take the sled, bring it to this side of the blade, and 0 clearance it here? That way I can put my hold down on here, and I can cut left or right of the blade, whichever is most convenient for the cut that I need to make. So I'm going to go ahead and just trim this little piece off, and I'll be ready to put my hold downs on. Now that I've got my table saw sled set up to work on both the left or the right side of my blade, I'm going to need a hold down that's capable of holding the piece of wood that I'm cutting right next to the blade. Now here's one of the hold downs from the old sled, and if I register it against the right side of my sled, you'll notice that there's about a 3/4 of an inch gap here. That's not going to work, so I thought I would be able to reuse these, but it looks like I'm going to go ahead and cut some new hold downs for this sled. My hold downs are a little bit wider than my sled. That's not going to be a problem at all. Once we get them mounted, we'll just raise the blade, run it through, and we'll trim them all to the perfect size. I need to go ahead and drill some holes for the hold downs. So what I've done is I've chose a Forstner bit that's just slightly larger than the head of my carriage bolts, and I've made a few measurements along my sled, and I'm going to drill about halfway through the plywood at those points. I've put a bit in my drill that's the same diameter of my carriage bolts, and I'm going to go ahead and drill right down the center of each of these holes and drill all the way through the sled. Now that I've got my carriage bolts in my sled, I need to turn my attention to the holes and the hold downs. And what I want to do is make these holes oversized so that they can wobble a little bit, because that will allow me to get a better grip on any material that I'm holding on the sled. So I'm just going to go ahead and just kind of score a rough line right down the center of these blanks. It doesn't have to be perfect because we will be trimming them to fit, and I'm going to go ahead and get the holes drilled. These blocks that I'm using to tighten down the hold downs, if you want to know how I made those, I'll put a link to the original video and you can watch that, because these are just recycled from the original sled. What I'm going to do is run them all the way down and tighten the hold downs so that I can trim them off. Now that I have the hold downs firmly attached to the sled, all that's left is to run it down both sides of the blade and trim them off. And when you want to hold a piece of wood, you simply lay it under the hold downs. And these little pieces that I cut off the hold downs are great. You can put them under the back end. Tighten them down. And we can joint this piece of wood without our hands getting anywhere near the blade. I'd like to thank you for joining me in the shop tonight. I know that I've already done a video on this once before. I'll include a link down below. This is probably the most used sled in my shop. So much so that I literally wore the other one out. This one, being made out of 3/4 inch oak plywood, is going to last a whole lot longer, and I'm really excited to have this back in my arsenal. I want you guys to know that you are always welcome in my shop. Come back and see me again real soon. Have a great evening.